Okay, so I have the unenviable task of standing before you right before lunch. So I'll try not to keep it too long. But basically our group, our team, are looking around the information integrity, the environment, the informational environment. And what I want to offer you today is kind of a high-level vision of what our team, how our team orientates itself and what directs our work. So the title is Reclaiming Meaning, Building Human-Centric Intelligence in the Age of Information Disorder. So I'd like to start with Moldova. Last year, intelligence services and the BBC reported that prior to one of Moldova's main elections, the space was flooded with inauthentic content by a coordinated Kremlin-backed network. This is according to the Moldovan secret services, and international secret services backed up that conclusion. What we had was content which generated 55 million views in a country of 2.4 million people. Now, let's think about that. That's 20 times the views than the population. That's not a fringe phenomenon. That's an attack at scale. That's a very serious effort at undermining our epistemic foundations of society. And it's not that these pieces of content were just, neutral political adverts or normal political messaging. They were narratives designed to divide, to evoke emotional responses, fear, anger, frustration. And they worked. And unfortunately, that's the environment we find ourselves in the contemporary age. We wake up every day with more access to information than any generation in history. Immediately when we wake up and look at our phones, we have videos, we have pictures, we have text, all trying to capture our attention, all vying for that important piece of attention, and all promising or claiming that they represent reality in some way, shape, or form. Between our endless scrolling and our ever-narrowing attention spans, we have kind of lost track of meaning. What we've become essentially is we've become rich in information and poor in understanding. Now, this isn't just a problem of fake news or mis and disinformation. These terms have been politicized so much and used so much that they've almost become redundant. The real problem is how information operates within our contemporary ecosystems, how it travels, how it changes, how it adapts, how it mutates, and how it manipulates. These are the important aspects. And I think the first place that we started looking was thinking about how our own internal hardware copes with this type of an environment. Our brains have evolved from an evolutionary standpoint of information scarcity. If we think back up until very recently, go back to the evolution of man, we existed in small tribes, small groups where information inputs and signals were at a premium. They were strong signals. They were shared within closed groups where trust was high. By comparison, even a couple of decades ago, most of our families, grandparents, parents, for example, had access to a very limited amount of information comparative to today. But today, we're drowning in an abundance. We're covered in torrents of information. And that information is designed specifically not to enlighten us, but to grab our attention. It's important for us to recognize that our brains are calibrated for scarcity and that the environment we live is it not working? Okay. That our brains are calibrated for absolute scarcity. So the information problem is at its core a cognitive problem. So at our team at Intelligent Government, we took this particular approach and decided to ask ourselves maybe some better questions. Not how do we stop fake news, which is something which seems almost impossible, but how do we give people the tools to recognize the architecture of manipulation? And we approached this by developing a three-layered system. The first layer is called pattern recognition. Now, our first prototype in this area is this thing you see here called plug-info. My colleague Stan Petkoff is leading that particular effort. And what plug-info does is it helps us to detect the little fingerprints of manipulation within large volumes of text. Particularly here, we're focusing on logical fallacies. So the classics, ad hominem attacks, false dilemma, straw man, all the greatest hits of manipulation. What we're hoping to achieve is to be able to identify those at scale, and not just identify their existence, but identify the patterns of use of these types of manipulation techniques across topics in different areas. Importantly as well, it requires us to localize that understanding, to take into consideration the linguistic specificities of Bulgarian, for example, as well as the cultural specificities around these types of manipulation techniques. The second layer is for synthetic detection, and this is our BUST prototype, and this is led by my colleague Sylvia Gargova. So I guess we've talked about this a lot today, various people have mentioned it, but we recognize that as AI tools become more powerful, more advanced, it becomes increasingly more difficult to tell the difference between what's real and what's not in terms of this type of content. What we saw in Moldova and what we saw in Romania last year, for example, should give us pause to think that the next disinformation campaigns won't solely use trolls and basements coordinated, but will be able to produce belief at an industrial scale using autonomous AI systems. It's getting to the point now where people who want to control narratives don't need to resort to traditional propaganda techniques of censorship. What they need to do instead is to flood the zone with so much noise that it becomes impossible to detect the signal from the static. We're living in an age, essentially, where now we can argue with a bot online and lose. And that's not because the bot is intrinsically better or more intelligent. It's that the bot is tireless, and it's able to synthesize information at a speed that's beyond human capacity. The third layer of our approach is narrative intelligence, and this is demonstrated most dramatically at the moment through our prototype Podio, which is an AI-powered research assistant for researchers, policymakers, journalists that works on discourse analysis. But narrative intelligence means essentially allowing us to have a big picture overview of the informational environment, to be able to track what actors are active, what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're spreading information, what types of tricks they're using, what types of networks are spreading specific types of narratives. This mapping allows us to look at all the different obscure streets and actors which exist in the informational environment. It helps us to understand the centers of gravity within our society that define meaning. And this takes us to something that was picked up by, I think, Ivo's panel and the last panel, which is there is a need for a kind of a shift, a need for a kind of a mental change in how we see these particular issues. We used to believe that intelligence meant knowing more facts, more data, more information. But in the current environment, that needs to be modified a little bit. Today, intelligence means knowing what to ignore, how to filter. In fact, filtering may very well be the supreme skill going forward. So, what we're suggesting is that once we reconsider, we think again about actually how we're thinking. We need to think about how to partner with AI and new technologies in a way that is more productive and which recognize the limitations on both. So humans, AI, sorry, I got lost. So cognitive science, as I mentioned already, for example, shows us that our brains are basically built for fast responses. It's built to react to stimuli such as emotional content, tribal content, identity content. That's what we're built for. And this is absolutely counterintuitive to what we want to achieve, which is to have space to consider these things more reasonably. Machines, on the other hand, they work at scale. They're able to analyze content at a large scale. And what we want to try to do is bring together a partnership which harnesses the strengths of both. So AI can take large networks of data and map it. It can establish patterns, but it lacks the contextual understanding of particular areas and topics. That's where humans come in. We understand context. We understand local specificity. And what we can really do is combine pattern recognition with this type of clarity of human reasoning and of moral reasoning. And to me, that's what human-centric AI really means. It's not about faster answers, but it's about developing better questions. So this is all a good way to start thinking about these problems. But what do we do about them? How do we deal with them? How do we address them effectively? Well, our team is also developing what we call a resilience program, a cognitive immunity program, that seeks to turn the insights that we gain through our AI tools, our AI-powered tools, into action. And my colleague Iglika Ivanova, who has a long experience within the Media Literacy Coalition here in Bulgaria, and ourselves, we've begun designing interactive learning tools, gamified experiences, media literacy programs that can help key stakeholders in society, the public, business leaders, policymakers, educators, to build information immunity, a vital set of skills for navigating the contemporary informational environment, to help us to be less poor in meaning, even though we are rich in information. So this brings us to then how this can operate in principle across the board. And the last decade, maybe one of the key points of the last decade was around automation, where human tasks, human jobs started to be replaced by machines and artificial intelligence. The next decade, I think, really has to be about augmentation, about building machines that are able to work correctly and well with human understanding and human specificity. The goal should not be for the creation of artificial intelligence alone, but the goal should be to create authentic intelligence, using these tools in a way that maximizes their effectiveness, their impact, and their ability to provide us with insights into the informational environment. I would say that there's something that more practically we can do, all of us together, and I would point to three main things. The first thing is, and I think it's very commonly discussed, very simple sounding, but it's actually harder than it sounds, which is to pause, right? We've all heard this. If you see a piece of information which evokes some kind of emotional reaction from you, to stop, to take 10 seconds, to think about, well, what benefit is there from me spreading this information? What kind of aspects of the discussion am I missing? Now, taking that pause between stimuli and response sounds easy, but it's extremely difficult because this content is all engineered to short-circuit that response, to bypass that moment where you stop and think. The second thing we can do is we can practice information immunity through things like verification. If you hear a claim that sounds like too good to be true, too close to what you believe, reinforces your sense of being right about something, take that as a flag to check that, to check the sources, to check the counter-arguments, to try to understand what could be missing from your understanding. It feels good to have confirmation, but it's harder, but I think the better work to just test your viewpoints and not just accept them uncritically. And the final thing I suggest that we can do is to demand that the key stakeholders in our society, our governments, our educational systems, our media, our business leaders, all invest heavily in cognitive resilience, not just cybersecurity. Cybersecurity protects one layer, but cognitive resilience is a layer which is extremely vulnerable. I think the future based on everything that's been discussed so far here, the future really depends on, and the success of groups in the future depends on their ability to establish a working partnership between technology and human insight. The people who will move forward in the future will be the ones who do this best, the ones who turn the fire hose of information overload into a wellspring of insight and knowledge. That future starts today. If the 20th century was about governing states, governing countries, I think very much that the 21st century might be about governing cognition. So with that, I'll let you go to lunch. Thank you. One last thing, sorry. The demo zone upstairs, you can see all of these tools that I talked about during the presentation. Thank you.